approximately 1,500 acres. This farm here is on 80 acres, but within the preserve are hundreds of acres, about 400 plus acres of open grasslands that have been managed here, had been in agriculture since the 1640s, and before that, the Picantico Indians lived in these areas here and down mostly on the river. So these areas had been mostly forest, but managed, and when the Dutch came here, pretty well cut everything. And so that agriculturally, this land up here has been open for a long time. The Rockefeller family took this land and protected it for their own agricultural use, while the rest of sort of suburbia came around here and expanded out from New York City. So we're glad to be able to host everybody here today. Of course, these couple of days and really use this space not just as a conservation space, but also as for the sake of social justice. So just to zoom out a little bit, I want to show you where we sit here. So the Hudson River is on the side here. This is Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow. The Rockefeller Park Preserve is an area that is nestled, again, mostly forest, but there's a lot of grasslands in here. It was, for a long time, tenant farming, Dutch tenant small farm holdings. Tarrytown was historically a grain space. Tarry refers to like wheat tarry, the bundle of wheat, and there was a lot of mills that were in these areas. So there's a lot of grain growing, a lot of dairy, a lot of vegetables, apples, potatoes, peaches in this area for a very long time. And at the turn of the century, it pretty well went to cattle. And in 2004, Stone Barns took on some of this land, and over the course of, until about 2007, there was a surrounding cattle operation that was being privately managed, and inherently the state would have taken on all that land. So in all the years of us being here, we worked with the state and with the private landowners to think about how we were going to manage that space when the state actually inherited it from what was a conventional cattle breeding operation. So what I'm going to tell you about is how that happened today. But I just have this, want to show this quote because I actually think this is kind of interesting as we think about what leads us to conservation. The world in which we were born is just one model of reality. Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you. They are unique manifestations of human spirit. Wade Davis. I think that this is an appropriate quote for this group because I want people just to really, we want to be really thinking about what the needs are in the 21st century for agriculture and how that differed, how now differs from the past 200 years especially of agriculture. We know so much more about our systems and about our relationship to this planet and the impact that we have on it. And we also know so much about what consequence came from the past 100 years of input-driven systems and industrialized agriculture and the grave consequences that we see with our soils, with our atmosphere, with our culture, and all of the things that are associated to that. So when we start talking about how we care for the land, I would say that it seems pretty clear to me that the farmers I meet are in this because we want to be making, we want to be caring for the planet just as much as we want to be feeding each other. In fact, that's a big impetus here. That we're really getting on this land for the sake of ecology first, that none of this really works in the future unless that is the goal, is that the land can sustain us, is that our soils have to be self-renewing and our systems have to be self-renewing and our care and governance has to be regenerative. So looking at concepts like soil and carbon, biodiversity, water, ecosystems health, and even our own biome in relationship to that, these are not new things, but they're certainly compartmentalized things. Things that used to be part of a greater whole of thinking about how we were in relation to our land. And what we've done over all this time is really kind of part all these pieces out and separate them. So just some reflection on the farmers that I see every day, many of the people that have been, everybody here that I see. If I would reflect on it, I would say many of the people, especially young farmers, are getting into this work, and not just farmers, but the allies, the bakers, the butchers, the artisans and florists and people that are engaged in this are getting involved in this kind of work because we're looking for a deeper connection to nature. We're looking to reconnect, in fact, because so many people have had that separation. And we're doing this for the sake of community action, well above being just farming for the sake of having a living. This is real action. A lot of the farmers that have worked with us over all these years, and even myself, have gone through universities, who've studied, done different things, had other jobs, and gravitate to land-based work because that is real physical action. It's a thing to do for your community. It's a way to feed people. And the other thing is that all said, farming alone is isolating economically. So we also want to consider this idea of farming on lands that aren't privately owned and working in cooperation with communities as a real way to get back to caring for regions, caring for the land around our communities, and actually building an economy that's actually regenerative, that isn't just a farm exploiting land for the sake of cash. We need to start thinking about how to build whole systems again and like this. And which leads to really where we're going to start our class today, which is around conservation and the concept of conservation. Again, just consider the term, where this even came from. And because conservation as an idea of caring for land and caring for communities is something that's relatively new. It's sort of parted out the same way we look at landscaping or horticulture out separated from agriculture and separated from conservation. That one is associated to beauty, one is associated to production, the other is associated to some sort of protection, and yet they don't interweave. I really think that they're all one and the same and actually feed themselves. So conservation, the idea of protecting our natural environment should be inherent in us. As a farmer, why would we think any other way? Why would people of the land, the people that are listening and working with these spaces, really think any other way? There's a lot of history here. In the Industrial Revolution was really a major part of that, a response to this idea of having more production, more and more production, less and less people involved in agriculture, and the exploitation of land bases, and also the use of inputs, mostly non-renewable inputs as fertilizers and things like that. And we started to degrade our landscape, which I think has also been the uprising of the term regenerative. Right? This term gets used everywhere. I think that the interesting thing, that what reflects for me all the time is that the term regenerative sort of assumes that there's an opposing term that's degenerative, and that we've done something pretty terrible to even have to be imagining an idea like regenerating our systems, rather than just trusting that nature is inherently generative, that communities are that way, that our systems can function in this way. And this is a map. I like to look at this because I study this map a lot. It's not super clear on here, but this is an aerial photo from 1926 of Stone Barns. And it's a picture that shows all of these various tenant farms that are there and the very high biodiversity that was in the space with all these different farms that were there. Even at that point, and shortly after, it became one big farm system. This idea of, came from, I think, very early on, let's say in the 1600s, with concepts of the idea of someone like René Descartes, who really was the first one to say, let's separate, I think, therefore I am, right? This idea that nature is something outside of us, and that seeped into European and American cultures as being a way to isolate ourselves from the rest of nature and sort of imagine the rationalized exploitation that it is for us. But later on, these ideas like Tragedy of the Commons, written in the 1830s, and this idea that created this dualistic mindset of either socialism or capitalism in our world. And so, but we have to remember, again, that the rest of the world was not thinking in that way, not thinking about ownership in that way. The Tragedy of the Commons was this idea that if everybody's sharing the same space, the self-interest of every individual will overrun that place and will ruin it. If we all had the rights to be able to care for that place together, inevitably someone would take advantage and ruin the space. And this sparked ideas, and Adam Smith and Karl Marx and all of these things sort of come from that. But the reality is, we need, in this paradigm, really need to rethink these concepts of ownership and what our value, what the equity of the land is around us, what it feeds us as a town, a community, a region, the country, our own bodies, all these things. What does it mean to own land, and what are the responsibilities of that? I had an interesting conversation many years ago with the Nature Conservancy from China, and they were talking about how they felt that having a socialist mindset of no one really owning the land, it actually encouraged abuse of the land because they didn't own it. So many people, really didn't take advantage of building soils and caring for that place because they didn't own it. But you could argue that even if you do own it, there's this idea that you own and have the right to totally exploit a place and use the soil like your own enterprise rather than the equity of all human and all living things, I think is something to consider. And when we look at land bases, like state preserves and land trusts and all these things, we could start to imagine why that's so important for us to actually think about how to protect land over long periods of time and how to impose an agricultural system on it, a biological system of management over the top of that is both productive and protecting that environment. And that comes to, in this time, there's so much of a language barrier in the way we look at this, and the risk and kind of inherent distrust of language that says, well, if I let you on my land, I think you might, maybe you'll run your cows across this land and exploit this, and it won't work for me. Or on the other side, we're farming your land for a lease and improving all the organic matter and doing all these things, and at the end of the day, we could just leave it. We just get kicked off the land and have left it better. And, we know what this problem is. It shows up a lot for farmers. We improve a piece of land and then are off of it and have only just improved it for the owners. The other thing is, when we have collective pieces of land that we're working as a community to manage, we have much more of a chance to actually engage in rhythms because there's a lot more of a net, a kind of protection around how we can control that. So cooperative integration, in this way, working together is really the only way to get to this. As I said, if we just look at conservation, the idea of a kind of a transaction, it's not enough for us to actually protect the land base fully. We really do have to think about all of these different pieces within the community and really honor the different perspectives that are in the community, the kind of stakeholders that exist, around the land and why it would be so important for the actual soil and earth itself, the people that are farming it, the town community that's around it, the local policy, the people that are funding those sort of things, all of those ideas. And all of those people, we want to be able to generate more and use that land for better good. So I think working on land together and thinking about this as a group, it becomes really complex, but in the long run, it really is the way, I think, that especially in places that are so urbanized, that we can actually bring agriculture back and restore regions around cities that have otherwise become entirely inaccessible for people to own and farm and be able to do that without huge amounts of private funding to maintain it. So things like community partnerships, protected habitat, participatory science, productive enterprises, and beautiful and delicious outcomes. That these are all really important parts of how we can work together to protect the environment that we're in. So I think now we're going to go through a set of things here. And this can be, I want this to be open a little bit so you can ask questions, and we're going to go through what basically is our transition from what was the nonprofit space, a state park, some private operations, the rest of our local community that has been using this preserve for a century, and how we all figured out a way to work together and to use this land for the good of everyone, which is a feat and an ongoing thing that actually is, I think, surprising and enlightening us all. So I'll start before we jump totally into this. Say, looking to the past is really key. Knowing those old maps of what was, the visual maps of what was farmed here, the people that lived here before then, the kind of land base that we're on, asking these deep questions about the deep history of this place is the first thing, because that's one of the things that we can all agree on, that we have this place. The geology of a place, the hydrology of the place. We sit in this incredible area that, this is a ridge here, essentially, and that is on the other side of the road we call Buttermilk. And that is the top of the watershed for about 100,000 people that are below us in Sleepy Hollow and Terrytown and Briarcliff. So we protect the watershed above this community. The other side of that ridge is Kensico. That's the water that goes down to New York City. So this is this really interesting little wedge. So understanding where we actually are and how much of a base we're on, it starts to matter. You start to think about the flow and how much water is going into the Hudson, and things like water recovery and infiltration and all these things that matter that can be solved by good farming practices. But then the fact is that we're actually trying to solve a lot of different problems because of 100 years of conventional agricultural systems. And so it's not pristine environment. It was a place that, when we really start to look at it, has a lot of issues. It has invasive problems, it has surface compaction, it has low habitat capacity in a lot of different areas, because that wasn't really the strategy. The strategy was raise grand champion animals, which is a strategy. And for lots of farms, the strategy of that agriculture, especially in the 20th century, was high quality product, input driven, high yield. We know that whole story. We're trying to go to a place where it's more nurturing, nutritious, not just for us, but for the habitats around us, for the communities around us. In order for us to do that and not totally spike the price of the thing that we're doing, it requires everybody's intention and everybody's attention to make that happen. So we started looking together with, when we knew that this land would be offered to us to take a lease agreement, about 3 years before we actually assumed the license, we started what we call our conservation action plan. I'm going to let this play for a second. I think there's no sound, so I'm just going to talk while this happens. But the conservation plan, really what we wanted to do was not get stuck in the idea of just having an agreement that says, we have the right to farm, the state has a right to see the plan, and together we can assess it year by year. I mean, there's so much variability in this. What we're really interested in is seeing some real specific things in our ecosystem improve. And I think they're really rational and easy things for all of us to understand. And this short video kind of points out some of the relationships to birds, to improvement of grasslands and the restoration of plant biodiversity, insect biodiversity, bird species, and at the same time, healthier animals, better water infiltration, more carbon sequestration, better organic matter. And it becomes a curious place again. The agriculture that's here is accessible and safe to be around, and starts to tie productive land into protected, safe land to be on, and beautiful, delicious, nutritious space. We're going to talk a little bit more about the bobolinks later, because the interesting thing is the biggest, most charismatic, beautiful thing on the landscape is usually the one that everybody gets really excited about. And we'll talk about that, but there's lots of little things that contribute to and are associated to something like that. The tree swallows and bluebirds, one example here that we have on the preserve, where as we change the methodology of how we're raising the grass and how we're grazing these animals over the space, bird species come back because the population of insects they're eating comes back. And then our work with partners, like in this case Audubon and ornithologists, private ornithologists, we start to work with, we really start to collaborate, because it does take seeing. Seeing is believing in many cases. We can talk a big talk all day, but the reality is the place changes when you start working on it differently, and when you really make some pretty clear boundaries about the way you're working in a space. So if you have your notebooks, this is really about kind of going through this entire document. So we wrote, it took us 3 years with relationship with the ecologists from the state and the farmers, and we built this conservation plan. And I'm going to give you the sort of skeleton of this plan to show you how this worked out, and some framework about how you can think about your own property. So how many of you are on properties or have access to properties that are public or land trust or not yours? Yeah, that's great. And how many of you actually have contracts or license agreements to farm on that land? Handshake? Yeah, totally. And so this stuff is really personal, you know? But it can't be that personal when you're on someone else's land and we still live in the system that we live in. We have to really design our language together and be super clear about what we mean about different types of systems and how to approach this. So we're going to walk through this different area. This conservation plan is called the Botanical Hills Cooperative Pasture and Field Management Plan. And it was originally written with the state of New York and Stone Barns, but there are a lot of other contributors to this as we go along. You'll see who plays an interest in this. And so this is all about multi-organizational relationships, long-term commitments, historic significance, mutual benefits to all. It goes across more than 1,500 acres of forest and preserve land, pastures. It's approximately 400 acres of grasslands on public and private lands, and focused primarily on productive, biodiverse, and protected space. So our main goals in this, there are collective goals that we have together as a group. One is just the presence of resilience, that we want the place to continue to be able to foster change and growth and health, that we don't really look at this as a cattle operation as much as a conservation act, that the animals that we're putting on this ground are totally associated to what we see as these animals' ecological service on this land. And we want that to be really clear with the state, because even in the same day, a conversation could go from, well, how much do you pay us so you can eat all of our grass? To how much are we paying you for managing our properties? So this is the thing, it really matters. And as we have a really wonderful parks director now in the state of New York who's very environmentally supportive, that doesn't always have to be the case, you never know. It's an appointed role. And there are a lot of other people down the chain that could be influenced or just decide that tomorrow we don't want to have this license agreement. So building a conservation plan helps to really inform. It really just builds the language out so you can go back. I want to say that this is a living document, so everything that we're going to go through here is something that we're reviewing. We review it annually, and we're reviewing it through the course of the year. We're looking at grazing and grassland biodiversity, both natives, wildflowers, and also forage quality. So we're not looking to make the environment native again, because a lot of these grass pastures are naturalized. But there are a lot, we recognize what percentages we want to see and how that biodiversity should improve. We're looking at quality of soils and carbon sequestration. The state has huge concerns around us allowing grass to grow again and not trimming it like a lawn, and the idea of invasives potentially taking over. And I think that has a lot to do with the idea that the park system is an expensive system, and has this invasive species thing has largely been managed across the state with herbicides. And it's our intention in this way to have no herbicides and no fertilizers on this space, anything synthetic, and allow, and from my perspective, anything physical is better than a chemical solution, and anything biological is better than a physical solution. So if we can solve this with animals and we can solve this with productive systems, then it actually is a win-win for everyone. It's a better economic model, because it's actually producing something, we're not using chemicals, and we're not spending huge amounts of labor or equipment to do work. And then we're looking at building habitat with the mindset that good grazing systems, good agricultural systems actually improve habitat for birds, for insects, for different plant material. And that we're looking at greater ideas around winter grazing capacity and using the properties year-round. So a couple of things about sort of complementary vision, and when we sit down, this is where we kind of go back and forth about, is this just good for a farmer to be on this land, or where is the exploitation? As we sort of negotiate and recognize where the tension points are, these are some really important places that have come up. And what we really have been saying is, agriculturally, we want to use this land. We see that, again, that the first purpose is ecology, that we want to be on this land, and it's in our highest intention to care for the health of this land and, one, reduce imported feed as part of just reducing overall inputs. We have a 100% grass-based diet. We do bring in some hay. I'll explain that a little bit. And we are improving winter forage. This goes along with us having to still bring hay in, because we're transitioning a landscape that has been managed in a certain way for 100 years. And so change takes time. So there's a certain amount of patience and flow. And also that this farm has largely been hayed over the years pretty intensively. Haying, if anybody's into that, is a very expensive thing to do, especially when we're working on hillsides and in small lots like we have. There are great farms producing hay north of us, an hour and a half organically, looking for good partnerships. So for us to bring in a truck or 2 truckloads of hay is 10%, 15% the cost of haying ourselves on our own property. So, and we maintain our own fertility. And any fertility we bring on with that hay helps to feed back the ground. We want to continue to reduce heavy equipment use, and that means not driving hay equipment, not driving tractors over the fields all the time, working with the animals on foot, working with low-stress stockmanship models and areas that we're with the animals and together as a group. And we want to continue to eliminate this idea of chemical and fertilizer and herbicide use across the preserve as a whole. And that does take a lot of trust from the state to see that change. And not only from the state, but for the rest of the community that watches this place change. From the conservation side, we want to enhance the habitat for grassland and field-dependent birds. The bobolinks had always shown up in the springs. The bobolink is a ground nesting bird, like the savanna sparrows and others. They're flying in from Argentina in mass. They check out the place, and then it got mowed, and then they dispersed. And this is one of the very few grassland areas in the southern Hudson Valley here that's quite this size. So it's a very special place for migratory birds. As soon as we started letting the grass grow, the birds started to nest, fledge, and mimic, and as they imprint, have continued to come back and nest in these fields. As sort of one example, just how quickly, 50 years it went since we had a single nesting pair of these birds, and as soon as we changed our systems, the birds began to nest and fledge, which was even a surprise to us because we thought maybe this would take a while to regenerate. We're looking to enhance habitat for pollinators, and we're trying to improve the grassland plant biodiversity as a whole, both for the pollinators themselves, other insects, the health of the soils, and the health of the animals. So the first thing we want to do is really map our places and know where the boundaries of our work are and try to find kind of the hot spots of what we're dealing with. And that just means that the entire community, everybody who's involved, all the stakeholders really need to know the land and have chances to get together, to meet and listen and talk about what we really feel passionate about. Because at the end of the day, everybody loves this land. So we're in a place where the state is, they have a great crew of people. Their responsibility is to a historic carriage park. There's 60 miles of carriage trail on this preserve. They're historic, they're National Historic Trust, so they have to be maintained. We have 100-year-old gorgeous stone walls that are historic that need to be maintained. We have 250,000 people that walk through this preserve a year, that have walked through here for generations of families and that love this place, that feel like it's part of their lives. And this is our responsibility. We're farming the space and making access to this. It's a historic carriage park and horse riding area. So there are constantly riders, and the horse riders associations and the Friends of the Preserve are important funders to help maintain the roads. So there's a lot of different angles and perspectives of people, what they think this place is for them and what needs to be respected as we go forward. And I think that's really important that everybody can come to the table in those first early listening sessions. So whoever is in your community, don't forget them. Bring them in. Anyone who is using these spaces should be coming in and have that conversation. And we did that through a series of things. One was just having listening sessions. So we would just give updates as we were going and have open forums so anyone could come, ask questions, do that, and we've since done lots of different programs so that we can let people know what's going on and why it's changing. For the most part, the only questions we really got in the end were, when are the cows coming back? Which is a good question. It's a good question to ask. So the first thing to really get into, as you look at writing this and deciding on this, is a little more grit here, is to get into the key ecological attributes. These are things that you really want to be able to name and answer. You want to be able to establish a baseline. What do you have in place? And you can do this subjectively or together as a group, or you can bring in partnered organizations. In our case, we have a lot of university and private partners, soil scientists, and ornithologists, and all these different folks that are engaged with us that helped us get a baseline. Not to mention, we put aside time. The farmers went out and did sampling across the place. We expanded all of our soil health testing, and we quickly put a carbon program in place with Yale School of Forestry and a quick carbon program there. We really want to be able to assign methodology and techniques to the work so that they're replicable things, that we're not just looking at it once and forgetting about it, because this is a living document. We want to show how the place is changing over time, and not every place is going to change the same way. Collectively, we could just say, the birds are back, but that was in 2 fields. So, and each of these spaces was managed differently. So really understanding how we're tracking the, let's say 5 different primary areas of this preserve, different topographies, different uses, everything from heavily overstocked cattle areas to fertilized and grazed area, hayed areas year after year after year that are really low fertility. There's all sorts of different environments within the big whole that what we're trying to do is create an equilibrium. And at the end of the day, we're trying to create a healthy grassland system as one whole system rather than like pieces. Sampling and monitoring. There's a lot of ways to look at this. Partnering, I think, is really important. University interns have been a great help to us. If you guys have been in the hallway in the foyer there and seen some of the laminated plant prints that are on there, those are all from the pastures. We have a wonderful intern, Angelica, from Pace University, who identified over 200 plants in the pasture system, and we've been tracking that now for 3 years, and seeing the pastures change dramatically because of the grazing systems, the high intensity grazing systems that we have. And then just to really understand how data analysis, synthesis, reporting, and assessments work, which gets complicated because what we found, and I'll talk about this in a minute, especially about the carbon, is that the sciences are not entirely complete. And there's a lot of different perspectives at how to share this information and how to get a myriad of information into one place that we can share with each other. And there are a lot of good regional and national organizations that are working on how to collect this information. But generally speaking, it's still pretty young. I'll just say from a scientific perspective, if you talk to scientists about looking at insect biodiversity in pastures, there's just too many variables to ask a question like that. There are some groups that are studying whole systems like this, but for the most part, the studies about insects have been very much species driven. So it's like, how much did this beetle change, or what's the habitat for this wasp? But we're talking about whole systems and maybe total biodiversity in places, microbiome systems, total number of insects and the diversity of those species. These are studies that really haven't been done collectively. Partially because most of the university funding and research is based on short-term, 2 to 5 year research. And 5 years is not enough for this kind of meta data. And we have also not had the kind of analysis to even be able to track it. So we're kind of in a new area, especially with carbon, especially with soil health, and maybe even most of all, the soil microbiome, which we're just recognizing how to even track. But we are, and we will, and it's going to keep getting more clear to us how that matters in how we manage these spaces together. And maybe to the point that we even get to a place that has an actual, national soil microbiome quantity. Would that be nice? Yeah, like a GDP for life. That would be great. So here's how we do this. When we write the action plan, we're really just summarizing all of our work together. What the history of the place is, what the practices were before, and then we get into the granularity of this. Recognize what our goals are, that we decide that we're going to have together, all those things I showed you, the key attributes of our work, and then the focal conservation targets. And these become real charts. This is where a lot of the living work happens and where the testing happens here. So this is one map of networks of fields and pastures. Another one for grassland and open field birds, plant biodiversity, native insect pollinators, dung beetles, soil health, carbon sequestration, all of which kind of have their own tracking. And their own research studies with different schools, and so all this stuff is coming in. And the way we do this can be in a few different ways, but essentially we look at what the attribute is of, say, network of fields and pastures. In our pastures, what are we suggesting is something that is an indicator of good conservation in the system? Something like habitat for diverse and native fauna and flora, forage quality, soil condition, landscape context. Each of these places are different. So we number our fields. We have approximately 45 individually numbered fields. Each of them has their own life list. Each of them we've done carbon cycle and analysis. We've 1,400 pits across 400 acres of ground. And we have a map. We have a study. So groups like UC Davis and Yale and Skidmore and others that are doing good soil carbon work are helping us figure out how to track this stuff. And I think really are hungry for this. This is the other thing. You don't have to beg these schools to get involved with you in this stuff, because there's a lot of people in universities, scientists who are sympathizers to this, that want to be engaged in this kind of science, that want to come out and look about and be engaged in complex experimentation. And as a nonprofit, we play another role that we can help fund those sort of things or bring grants in to help fund, because it's also part of our thinking that every intern, every person that's working in this space is paid for the work that they do. So, which is another part of how we kind of design that. So the way we kind of look at it, once we recognize what these attributes are, we're looking at indicators. What is the indicator of health? Well, diversity of native grasses and forbs, structural diversity through the growing season, how that might change. We want to look at current condition, desired conditions. This is an old map. In fact, the newer maps show, just because it fit nicely on this slide, but we actually show what current condition is now is actually original condition at the beginning of the conservation plan. That goes then to current condition and the desired condition with amendments to that. Because we're learning. And we could have assumed that, all right, well, best case scenario is the birds come back. Well, the birds came back. Now what? What are we learning from that? What do we learn from this relationship? Because our ornithologist came in and he comes every morning and he listens for the birds and he's tracking as these things are nesting and making a life list of all the birds, not just this species, but of all of the birds that are around. So the 120 different species that are hanging around here and living in around these pasture systems. And he's out there and he says, well, if we're going to do this every year and track it, you can't have all these variables. Like, you really have to be clear about when you're going to move the animals through this space. And starts to get us to thinking, like, how, not only do we want the birds to come back, but we want to figure out a way to have these animals coming in and out of where these birds are and show that the integration of these animals, it's not just about leaving space to let the birds come back, it's about an integrated system of how we use these animals to actually make better habitat for those birds. So that is actually really exciting and very difficult as a scientific experiment because it's a lot of data sets. And it requires a lot of interaction in interdisciplinary science, which doesn't regularly happen. So it's very fun. When it comes to soil health and carbon and microbiome, these are new ideas. Even since we've been here at Stone Barns, we came here in 2000. I came here in 2003 and started working on these soils and getting the farm set up and the crops and pastures. The concept of soil health was there, but there was no one doing any kind of research around physical, biological, chemical relationships of soil health. This is a concept I hope some of you have seen Will Brinton today. Has been a huge supporter for us. We've really learned a lot from him and Harold Van Ness and Bob Schendelbeck and folks from Cornell and all around the Soil Health Institute, places that are helping to demystify this concept of what health is in a soil system beyond just NPK chemical testing. This is something that's within the past 10 years that's become a reality and what we're looking for in soils. 10 years. And something like carbon is still very brand new. Using, testing carbon at different layers, we use this quick carbon device, which is basically a hand spectrometer that was developed by Yale that allows us to see essentially how much carbon is at each layer as we go 15, 30, 60, 90 centimeters down in the soil and do these pits over and over. And these are farmers doing these samples. We're out there doing this space, and while we're moving the animals around, we're digging pits. So this is kind of citizen science, farmer science.
Yeah. Do you know anything about, or have you done any experimenting with measuring sound to see how much biodiversity or conservation is at the different levels and maybe how successful they've become based on sound?
I love that idea. And Cornell is doing great work on sound for the overall ecosystem, which is a really great thing to study and a very powerful tool to share. We've not done formal studies in that way, but what we do is we bring the community out there to listen. And it's loud. That would be our level. It should be louder, right? We know that we want to hear this. We want to see the fireflies. We want to hear the crickets. We want to see this moving. And it's all relative to the soil. Again, when we're talking about bird habitat, the tie-in for something like that, in this example, we pick a piece of property. In this case, the land base is up on the other side of the hill here on Buttermilk Hill, which is an area that was hayed, run over with tractors, very compacted. The plant speciation was a lot of plantain, a lot of low grass like anthoxanthum, sweetgrass that was really just working on trying to break the compaction of all the tractors and things that had driven over it for all these years. It's thin topsoil, maybe 4 to 6 inches. Had never really had many animals on it at all. So when we started up there, it was kind of obvious, reading plants and understanding that plants are telling us and responding to what the situation is, whether that's nutritional or a physical attribute or a chemical attribute. We read the plants, we read the ecology and try to recognize how to offset that problem. And we know that the soils are compacted in these areas, partially because of the plants that are there, and partially because we know what the history was of the place. So to respond to that, what are our choices? Again, like I said, biology always beats physical. What you could do is rip that field with a plow and reseed or something, or you could just graze cattle and sheep on it at the appropriate moment. So we also want to make sure that in these spaces, the bobolinks and sparrows, they like long vistas. So the sort of key areas that we can that we can help to protect the habitat for these birds when they come back are the areas that have the longest vista. We know that that's where these birds are going to come and try to figure out where to mate, and if there's enough to eat and there's enough to make a nest from, the females will stay with them and they can nest and they go from there. So that's a really important thing that we want to track and support. So as we're looking at these fields, we know that in the first year we just said, let's let it grow. And the grasses grew in, the bobolink, one pair came. We left 100 acres. We didn't touch 100 acres of grass just in the spring because we were like, well, we'll just sit here and watch and see if something comes back. And it did. So presence, absence, solved. Presence. The next step from that when we're studying these things is what is the capacity for this bird to stay in that area? That's when things start to change. Because the reality is the bird's not going to fledge until July. And by July, the seed heads are up, the grasses are dry, it's not good grazing forage, the ground is hard, so the animals aren't doing the same work on the surface. So using animals like we do, where we're generally moving our herd of approximately 100 head of cattle and about 250 sheep, are moving over about 3 acres a day. And depending on the time of year and the quality of the forage and the space. But when they do that, they stay close and they press down. And so when we get them on the ground, they're changing the texture, the surface of the soil. And as I mentioned, the plants are responding to the ecosystem. And those animals just changed that ecosystem. So plants, new plants, different sets of plants will respond to that new environment and come up. And sure enough, they did. And so the following year we said, well, maybe we could get them out there real early. We'll get them out, we can get the cattle out there in the second week, right as soon as we get green up in April. The first green grass comes through, and we'll just move them through really quick. And we think that we were sort of predicting that the birds might come back in early May, and that would give us enough time. Sure enough, we moved them through. The texture of the soil was just beautiful. It was like, because they were all so close, it went from being this flat pan with lots of space between the grasses, and lots of plantain, and things that are just trying to break up the surface. They changed the structure, and they left their manure pads and everything, and what went through the space. The change in surface made a huge difference for water infiltration. It changed the top texture. Different plants started to germinate in the wake. The fertility from the manures changed the space. Even within the same year, the grass species changed in this pasture. Without seed, without steel, they just changed the space. And in the same year, 3 nested. And we were able to move the animals around that group. And that's what we're learning. Early, let the birds come in. Once we know where the nests are, we can give them these rings, these circles, and move those animals around those circles so that they have enough. But as these grasses get more rich and new species of legumes come up and new forbs and broadleafs and natives come in, that means all the insects they eat, which is, in this case, these guys eat mostly little caterpillars and stuff and things that are crawling around. They're going after those, and the more feed source there is, the more nest source there is, the more imprint and the more species come back to that space. So that's what we want to keep showing. This is kind of an anecdotal story here. That, in a spreadsheet, is pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of data. And that's the thing that we need to show.
How do you balance the use of agriculture or animal impact that does bring back that richness and that biodiversity with sometimes the restrictions that are placed on protecting it? So in this instance, say you get such a rich pasture that there's ground nesting birds everywhere, and the feasibility for you cordoning off these circles is prohibitive from you even grazing that pasture. Where do you find that line?
Yeah, that's a great, we don't have that problem now, but the first time I ever saw bobolinks, really a lot of nesting bobolinks, was actually on the backs of Devons walking through a pasture. And we're talking about a kind of grazing system. The next thing is changing the story, changing the mythology around this stuff. But the reality is that these animals work together. That cow is not going to step on the nest if it's not scared and if it's moving at a pace. So the incorporation of us in that connection, this idea of low-stress stockmanship, of empathy with these animals, means everything. It's all on foot. We're not driving these animals. We're not pushing them. They move from one space to the next. It is a big, healthy group. And I think that this plays a big role in this, is that the management strategies and the interaction with the ecology are really important. So if we were just running them through or driving equipment, that's much more dangerous to the bird population. The other side of that is if you graze it too hard, if you really let them stay, which is why we're moving daily or staying around these other sides, that we can really keep that going. So in this case, a few other practices that we have in place are really just the fact that ecological service is everything. That we should not have a species on this farm, pig, chicken, cow, if it doesn't have a real service to give. So recognizing the service of that animal is key. And if that means that we just are not optimizing the number of animals to cover every square inch and eat every blade of grass, then that's fine. We know that. Eat a third, trample a third, leave a third is a strategy. And that's the way we're kind of moving these animals through the space. Multi-species, high-density grazing systems, fast-moving across, testing grasses, recognizing from there on a daily move. Pastured poultry as fertilizers, as fertilizer spreader. The birds do eat grain, and half of that grain becomes fertilizer. The other half becomes egg and chicken. So in this case, we know that we can leave about 35 pounds of phosphorus on the ground per acre with a flock of 800 birds across 22 acres. It's a kind of way to calibrate and feed some of these spaces that had been burned and burned and burned by fertilizer and hay. And so in some of we're using the chickens to restore these. We have far less chickens than we can really fertilize all the land for. So we're using them in sections and doing areas of fields one by one. Trail goats has been a great one for us. The preserve, that was largely the herbicide use that was really hard for everybody to get away from, was underneath fence lines, along stone walls, and along trails. So blocking off sections and raising goats and leaving our herd of about 70 goats in these fenced off roadways allows them to clear the sides. And over the years, we've gotten closely related with the park's ecologist to identify hotspots and green zones and know where, and they've really helped to design the way our herd moves over the course of the year to take care of things like devil's walking stick and black swallowwort and mugwort and porcelain berry and akebia and all of the many supposedly invasive species that are impossible, that the deer won't eat, basically, but the goats do. And they do a great job, and it's zero herbicide, and we are essentially solving the trail problems with these animals. Woodland hogs, maybe some of you guys have seen those, waste-fed, forest-raised. And then things like pastured forage seeding and perennial plantings. As we continue to grow, putting in these kinds of systems in places that are appropriate. It doesn't always have to look just like it did. If these big open pastures could use new plantings and new perennial systems and different things happening, it's not just about us maximizing a grazing program or about us trying to keep more and more cattle. So diversifying the landscape, reimagining the landscape, and doing the appropriate steps to get this forward still actually all have the capacity to make enterprise. So at the end of the day, each of these things does have to pay. The idea is that we're not just charitably giving to the state, that each of these things is actually an economic enterprise, and that the time we spend and the lack of equipment that we use are really key in making this system work properly. So people and animals and some equipment and some seed and lots of partnering, especially in the research, is really key to the community effort here. Some of our overarching issues are things like making sure that the riparian zones are protected, that fence line maintenance is there, and stone walls, that because there are so many people, we have to make sure that nobody's walking down this trail with a stroller. You never know, it's a lot of cows. But just the idea that this is about relation to community. So think about what your community and this land is to offer. Is it just that you have the access to this land, or is this something that is actually a resource for the rest of your community to be on? Which I think all of these lands ought to be. But the capacity to do that has a lot to do with safety and just difficult conversations that are complex, that don't end up happening. And so it feels very private. But part of this idea is you want people to feel invited to the land. We want to keep getting people closer to the land. So we don't want to feel like everybody's off limits to let us do our thing. So that's, I think, some of the biggest complexity of this. So some of the other systems we were talking about, you were saying, if inevitably we want more diversity, and we want it to not require more inputs from outside. We want to continue to reduce what inputs we bring to the space. We want the soils to improve, and we want the place to be more self-generating, right? I mean, that's the idea. In the end, as all of us know as farmers, most of the time, less input gives us more from a space. That most of the treadmill of agriculture is all the stuff we had to put in to pay back for. And that continues to get harder at scale. So in these kind of systems, the biological approach, being on foot and working in systems that don't require sprays or input fertilizers, these are complicated ideas. They require a kind of maturity of a landscape and a maturity of a community that not every place has the access to. And that's what we should be striving toward. The reality is, if we don't have access to that, let's continue to push and make that happen. I mean, especially here, I couldn't ever imagine farming in Westchester County. I never imagined. The whole idea of even moving here, when I first heard about this place, sort of farm in Westchester, I like literally was thinking, how could you even farm near New York City? But to see a place like this, and to see what's actually happening here, I realized, I mean, I don't own this, but I love this place, and I'll care for this place as long as I have the chance, and I definitely don't think I could do that alone. So if everybody, I imagine that everybody who's working on your own land feels like that too. The reality is, thinking of ownership of that land as some kind of part of your enterprise rather than a thing that is the foundation of what we're doing in our communities, that's where we need to make a shift. And so having access to that land is really key. How many of you work with land trusts? Or on state land? Anybody work on state land? State land's often more complicated because for one reason or another, and land trusts do have more of a tendency to want people to farm on those lands because they were previously farms and things. But even still, some of the land trusts that I've helped to meet with and things like that have found that the land trusts themselves are really reluctant to have too much farming on them because they feel like there's exploitation. which is why I think us building a plan together is really key, because that's the purpose of land around that. Krishana?
I think one of the most important things from my experience with working with a land trust is farmers having a really long-term lease. It was what you were saying before, when you have those when it's not your land, you don't put the time and energy, but when you think it's yours, you can really sink your teeth in and do the things you want to do right. And it makes for such a better system, both for the land trust and the farmer, and also for the land trust to trust the farmer to do what needs to be done on that land. It's kind of, when you have a long-term lease, you feel like you have their vote of confidence to do that, and that pushes you even further, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree to that. On that note, I mean, part of that, one is to get a commitment for a long-term lease. The other is to give reason, right? Which is the sort of combination to that, is that we want you on this land. We want you on this land. We as people who protect land trusts and public lands and state, all of these things, we want you on their land. And if you're a private landowner, you want us on your land. That's the thing we want to encourage. That's the generative nature of this whole thing, is that it's, I always think about a quote I heard from Peter Forbes from Vermont, from the Center for Whole Communities. He said, "The land is not a pickle." Preservation of land is not something you put in a jar and keep away from everyone. It's a thing that you engage and you keep alive and enrich and allow people to be a part of it. And I think that's a really important thing. And we have a centuries before us of abuse and an entitlement of this idea of ownership that has given us lots of reason to not trust this idea. But we live in a new era, and I think we need to see that paradigm kind of come out. So, that's why I really think that this relationship, while it's been complicated for us, is good for all. So, just a quick thing. I know we're pretty close. Do we have time for questions or anything like that? So I'll just about finish. But you guys can ask questions as we go here. But we have a lot of partners in this. Certainly not just doing it as farmers. We have several universities that we're working with, soil labs, carbon labs, tool companies, people doing, making devices like the soil microbiome meter and the quick carbon spectrometer. New York State, which has been a huge support, and different field experts who have come and gone with us and helped in different ways and endured with us, especially the bird studies and groups like Audubon. Consultants like Jonathan Lundgren, who's an amazing farmer and scientist from North Dakota, and Jill Clapperton, who's been doing all kinds of bionutrient work with soils and the relationship of the nutrient density of the food that comes off of land that is managed like this, and to show that as a result of our good work. All of the amazing interns that have been a part of this and are just aspiring stewards, and all of the farmers and chefs that are telling this story, that are out there on the ground and infinitely interested, just very interested in what's going on in the land and want to know more, and all of young farmers and people who are just returning to the land to learn about this and getting to know dung beetles, getting to know orchard grass, getting to know these individuals and what they're doing, what we're doing together. This is the thing that we're missing, and why we have to be more engaged, why there needs to be more farmers and more ecologists and more chefs that are sympathetic to this sort of thing. So in translation of all these things, this is really key, that we have lots of ways to storytell, and all of these pieces need to be honored in our story. We know that there's, what's interesting is that as a farmer, I'll tell you all this all day, and you might say, well, where's the data? Because it sounds like you're really just trying to tell me that this is the way you want to, farm on this free land. Well, that's part of the story. The reality is other farmers would say, I'm with you. Experientially, I've seen this. We've seen this. The stewards of the land, there are very few of us farming in this country and around this world even. People that are less and less all the time. We need people on the land. We're the ones that are paying closer attention. We're the messengers. So experiential learning is critical to this whole thing, but so is practical science. And we have to find that kind of engagement. The rest of the community, we just want to keep inviting them in, answer their questions, demystify what's happening. We did this thing where we built a bunch of benches. We built 10 benches, and we placed them all around the park preserve, each in these sort of vista points. And we made a little brochure that we gave at the state park, and it basically just explains all the work that we're doing bench by bench. So as people walk the trails, they sit on the bench, and if they have this little thing, they can learn about where they are. Just an easy little simple thing that we were able to do that is it's just engaging. You're not just walking around in sort of separated nature. You're walking around in a living space. That's part of our ecosystem. The chefs, as everybody's already seen, reverence in the kitchen and storytelling at the table is how our message gets out. There is no question about that. There's less than 1/3% of our population farming. So if you think that we're telling everybody the story and that we are the ones that can solve this alone, I think we're mistaken. We're the beginning of that story, and that has to be carried all the way to every eater. And so the storytelling and the way that as we share the beef and as we share the fruit and as we share the vegetables and the grains that come off of these spaces, if you're not telling the story about the care that you've given to the place, they can't share that with the next person in line. And that's a really important thing that we just continue to maintain that. So this is it, but we say that the future vision, these are some of the things that we want to look forward to. That eco-beneficial farming practices are valued for their service, not just subsidized, but valued. What is the value of water infiltration and capture? What is the value of carbon? What is the value of the microbiome and of insect populations? Value. Public and private conservation land is stewarded by farmers. Farmers are engaged in land care more. And science and practice further complement each other, that we have scientists who are working in the field with us, working in generative systems, that our land and living soils become the equity of our community. That this is what makes us who we are. It's what makes the Hudson Valley the Hudson Valley. It's what makes the Finger Lakes. It's what makes Sonoma, we would call it, wherever. That the planetary microbiome, the whole thing reflects in our own personal health. And that cuisine and the way that we create all of the food and dishes and storytelling and eating and the ritual around table is a reflection of the way we care for our place. That to me is like what a good future might start to be rebuilt here. So I have a little bit of time for questions, and I'll just stop here and we can let these guys graze. Mm-hmm. So just grab the mic and you can.
Thank you. My question is logistically, when it comes time for you guys receiving all this data from all of these partners, who is there a person or a team? What's the structure of like taking all of that information and making it into something useful?
Yeah, so this has grown over time, and what the biggest, most complex thing is where all this stuff goes. And we've finally gotten to, we actually hired an amazing group of a team, Terragenesis, to help us do some design work around actually building out our ArcGIS. But you need somebody who's going to be able to run software. And GIS is the one sort of ubiquitous spatial, geospatial data area that you can put all of the information into. So at this point, we're talking about running spreadsheets in fields, and then it goes into ARC. But you have, if you actually want to get, if you want to synthesize that data and summarize this stuff and see how our grazing data, like the weights of our animals over this space is related to the health of the dung beetle in that, like that's complex. So where does that, that's not something we're doing sketching out on paper. So that's a bigger data set. We can easily say this many birds, we saw this, we saw the decomposition of these cow pads increasing over time now that there is no more Ivomec and use of different chemicals and dewormers for animals so much, and we're seeing the manure decompose faster. But all of these they're like little things, and the percentage of wildflowers and how that relates to our bee colonies. So ArcGIS is a good place to put that, and we still have to continue to collect data to even get more of a clear analysis because, again, this is long-term research. We received a grant from Sarah de Quasart, 10th, that helped us get some monitoring equipment, so scopes and some sampling equipment and things like that, soil sampling equipment. It helped to cover the cost of more soil samples because they got pretty expensive, especially doing any of the microbiome stuff. If you've done that, they're very expensive samples, like plus 200. Even soil health samples are in the $60 to $90 range. So if you're working across large acreage and you want baseline information, you have to be supported. The funding has to be supported in other places. There's ways for people in the community to support things like the goat grazing. So a lot of it's Excel or in Google Docs that we're making sheets and adding and then going from there. So we're tracking all these things, and the interns are essentially synthesizing that. And at the end of the day, our ornithologist, who's a PhD in biology, is really the one that oversees the database and continues to collect it. So everybody kind of has different roles. If anybody meet Shane today, who's compost, Shane has a pretty strong role in overseeing the coordination of all the stuff that's happening in the field. Mike and the livestock team are sampling while they're out there moving the animals. So everybody kind of takes a piece. The best way for us to do that is just to have regular meetings. We call them CAP meetings. And so we just get together and arrange that. And Shannon has helped to organize all the interns as they come in through the different schools. A lot of this team, like we sort of respond in different ways. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. You need the wand.
I'm wondering how much you're like with the seed mixes that you're choosing in terms of bringing back those native species. If there's an availability of like eco-regionally adapted ecotypes for those right native plants, and then also, I mean, how much is just naturally going to succession from those birds that are returning, and where you're sourcing seeds from for that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, that is actually a really great question. There are very few places that are producing good native seed mixes. There are great companies like Ernst and Prairie Meadow, Prairie Nursery, so those are all mixes that we can apply. But if anybody's applying wildflower seeds or that sort of thing, they're very expensive. I mean, in the thousands of dollars for doing acres. So you're really talking about a lot of investment for something that I personally truly believe will change over time because that's how nature works. So I am always on the fence about adding. We do apply, and we'll broadcast at certain seasons and things like that. But it's not our intention to control the entire plant speciation. We believe that the plant speciation will respond to good practice. And that's what we've seen. especially with things like the clovers and a lot of the wildflowers, because as things like plantain back off and the soils soften, things like bird's foot trefoil come in, and all sorts of things. And even the things that we necessarily might say we don't want, like Canadian thistle, might show, because before they were just obliterated. But there's still that problem that they're solving for. So they might, solve for a few years and then they disappear. And then new things come. Things like, one of the things that we struggled with the state some was talking about what we wanted to see as an aesthetic for a wildflower space. And the idea of like asters, we do a lot of our own self-collection of asters and a lot of other plants, and we have some nursery space where we'll broadcast seed. We leave patches and corners and things like that so that they can perpetuate across those spaces. The birds are moving them around. So there's a lot of that kind of naturalizing. But something like, and milkweed and things like that, we just let them finish. Yeah. And just let them go. But when it comes to something like wanting to see a field look like goldenrod or little blue stem, I don't resonate with that so much, because actually the goldenrod is showing up in places that aren't really good pasture spaces. So there are some areas that we leave totally untouched as meadow. And we might see things like tall blue stem or odds and ends, but we definitely, like, knowing that what we're doing in that space might have subtle differences in the plant speciation, I think, over time, without spending tens of thousands of dollars on seed.
In some of your research, do you find it difficult to set aside an effective control area to be able to tell the scientific community that this wouldn't have happened otherwise? I've heard a couple people, especially with kind of holistic managed grazing, is like, how do we know that it was a byproduct of the animal impact and it wasn't already trending this way? And yet, as a land steward, it's also hard to take any portion of your land out of what you know is the right way of managing your land. And so how do you balance those two things?
Well, for one, we didn't take it all on at once, and we built an enterprise based on about 2/3. So some things like the bird habitats, that we didn't build the animal program wasn't meant to fill all surface. So there's areas that we know we could leave for many months open. And we had areas like winter stockpiling that we could leave. So we knew that we had a lot of extra ground, more ground than we needed necessarily for the animals. And at the same time, there's whole areas that we don't go. In fact, there are areas that we could go into, but we've sort of held them. So there are hillside meadows. There's a lake just down, Swan Lake, which is down in here, that has a pretty large meadow. And there's a lot of good native grasses. It's been established. It's never had animals on it, so we've left that as a control. We also know our pastures, so we've managed in this practice for 15 years. Even though we're on new ground that has this new management only for a few years, we also have our own reflection of the land that we've managed for this long and how it's changed. But I mean, I think that can be argued, right? But I think the way to argue that would be like, well, we know if we just leave the space, the things like multifloral rose and black swallowwort, which is another pretty bad one for us around here, if the pastures aren't managed, they have to be mowed. And that is what we're offsetting: diesel, tractors, and labor. So even if we were saying we're not even improving this place or changing it, we're offsetting the cost of tractors for the state and labor and mowers and all of that stuff and diesel fuel by using animals. So at the end of the day, it still has to be managed because we don't burn here, right? So if it goes, which is actually another thing, there's no burning in Westchester County. However, there are billions of dollars of homes around us. And if brush fills 400 acres of grasslands, then the fire risk in this area is massive. So it's another kind of thing to consider, that the animals are also sort of inherently protecting from fire risk, and which has definitely been a thing that's come up in the past. The fire department is a very small department, and this preserve, with all the people that come in it, is a pretty high risk. So even the department knows the value of the grazing system.
Thank you. I'm sure, like a lot of us in this room, are doing our part for conservation stewardship and really invested in promoting healthy grasses, healthy ecosystems within land and human communities and non-human communities. But I'm also wondering how perhaps we might be able to like extend the idea of conservation stewardship to people not in this room, people who, for a lot of reasons, have the most intimate relationship with the land. So like from my area of Michigan, where farmers are farming 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 acres, how can we get them to also start thinking about conservation stewardship? Is a thing that I was thinking about throughout your talk, and I don't know the solution to that question, but it seems like a really large problem, because I think all of us have an interest in conservation stewardship, but how do we also get the people with the most impact on the land to also become conservation stewards?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think it's a good one to close with, because this is, we're going to kind of get out and get to keynote and everything here. But one way I would look at this is that most of the food is being eaten in cities, right? And in high populated places. And our choices as eaters makes a huge difference. A lot of the land trusts are happening in suburban spaces and around urban spaces. And they're usually in a place where, you know, you just couldn't own a piece of property like that. And most of the time they're in land trust because they couldn't afford owning the land to begin with, but really wanted to have a conservation easement on their property. You know, wanted to protect it for longevity. Their family has passed down this farm and they can't do it anymore, so protect it and walk. But, you know, that's where people have to get back on the land. And in a more rural area, it's a little bit different, because you can't turn your own home farm. You could put a conservation easement, but it doesn't solve the problem, right? So the side of that would be that it takes a bigger cultural shift to allow people to be better buyers, so that farmers can include those kind of aspects on the land. And I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't own land. I think that the reality is we don't want to be using our land as our enterprise. We don't want to be exploiting that land. We were able to do that a long time because we could put stuff in it and then take it out of it. But that's not how it's going. We're trying to build it. We're trying to soak carbon. We're trying to collect water, right? So if that's actually what we want our farms to do, that's not just on the shoulders of the farmers. Like I said, that comes on the shoulders of the eaters, the consumer, at the end of the day. And that's where the commitment of what this conference is really all about. You're not alone. You have to find the partners to do this with, because you cannot do this by yourself. We want to. The reality is farmers are strong people that have lots of different talents and autonomous, but there are not enough of us to change the community without the support of the rest of the people. So as a buyer, just as a consumer, farmer aside, I want to continue to buy from places that are protecting their land better. And if maybe that comes at a premium now, but only because there are only a few people doing that, because we're still in this mindset of cheap input systems. So it is a transition that if it could change overnight, that would be excellent. But the reality is the work on public lands and land trust lands and even private lands like around these areas are a kind of stepping stone, sort of a learning and a re-immersion, so that they can make better choices. We're already seeing it. I mean, the reality is there's lots of stickers that you can put on your food that make it more conscious and ethical. And what does conscious and ethical mean? It means the farmer can actually do what they have always wanted to do, you know? There's no farmer I know wants to spray chemicals and wants to have a monoculture unless that's the only option. And that's the problem with the food system as a whole, is that we haven't collectively committed to these ideas. So I love the working with the conservation piece, because it gives me my actual relationship to something beyond what is just the farm production. Like, it's a good ecological service. And so I guess I can't really answer that question, except that more people have to hear what you just said and understand that when they're eating, they're making a choice one way or another every time. And, so if you have good partners in who you sell to, or if you're selling to wholesale to somebody like a big farm has to, that you're selling to somebody who actually has a heart and is ethical about the thing that they're doing. That will hopefully get us to a place where, as we've seen in a lot of big organizations, there's a little bit of commitment now to the concepts of regeneration and to ecology. And we just have to keep encouraging it. So thanks for joining.